Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 2 discussion. Today, I wanted to put together some discussion of scaling damage in PathOfExile 2. However, it's important to note that I'm keeping this video leak-free. This means that it's going to be general principles, not looking at so many specific examples, because some specific examples have been leaked. We're not going to cover that. They'll all date anyway, because chances are things will move pretty quickly in early access. No, what we're going to look at here is enduring information, stuff that you can use to plan characters into the future, but there might be a couple of little nuances that we end up missing out as a result. So I guess it's time to let the cat out of the bag on something. I'm going to be working together with gaming strategy site Mobalytics. We're going to be working to put together a whole bunch of guides for PathOfExile 2. They're going to be something that can be updated after the fact. One of the biggest problems with YouTube as a platform, there's actually very good reasons for this, but YouTube don't let you modify a video that you put up. So once you commit it to the public, you can take it down if it's completely and utterly wrong. You can change the thumbnail to say, hey, there's a big mistake in this. But if it's just a small mistake that doesn't quite warrant anything like that, like if a number changes from 5 to 7% because of a different game version coming out, or alternately, maybe you find a slightly better pathing on the passive tree, there's not a lot that you can do. And as a result, it can be really difficult to issue corrections and the like. One of the things we're going to be doing with Mobalytics is having written versions of these guides. Anything that I make a video on that feels like it could be useful in written form as well, I'll end up doing a guide for them. And that's something that can be edited after the fact, both by myself, but also by other people. And there'll be a bit of a dream team of content creators from PathOfExile who will be checking and rechecking a lot of the stuff that goes up on Mobalytics, so that they'll be more likely to find any mistakes that I made and be in a good position to correct them. Because let's face it, I'm human, I certainly make mistakes. I do also have a fair number of planned guides that I'll be doing over the first week or two. All of these things, I'm going to be putting together guides for Mobalytics as well, and they'll be there. That will be the authoritative source. So ultimately, the YouTube video is what we think is right at the time that we write it. The Mobalytics guide is going to be that at first, but then it will improve from there. Anyways, let's start with the most important part of the video, which is just talking about what we don't know yet, so that we don't end up getting into a whole bunch of sidetracks about things that we just know nothing about. The time this video is being recorded, we know only the very basics of how ailments are going to work in PathOfExile 2. We also know none of the nuances of critical hits. We know the very basics, but we don't know things about how players might elect to scale them. There's a whole lot of things we just don't know when it comes to crits. Here's the plan. I want to supplement this video with a Critical Hits 101 video and an Ailments 101 video. And my goal is to have both of these out within about 96 hours of the game going live. Now, I'm not going to promise that timeline, but that's my intention. These might have different names when they come out, but they're going to be somewhat of a deep dive into each of these mechanics. I think they'll be among the most important videos that I put out, but they're also not necessarily the most specific to the build you're playing. But I do think they'll be really useful, especially if you're in a situation where you find you can't really progress any further and you need to make some big changes to your build, then this will provide some options for it. These will also have Mobalytics write-ups, and those will be kept up to date by myself and or other people. I want to start with 4 different ways that you can scale damage. This is going to seem really basic because this splitting of things into 4 different categories is going to apply to other games as well, even games that are totally different to PathOfExile. Something as different to PathOfExile as World of Warcraft. This same strategy would apply. Something as different to both PathOfExile and World of Warcraft as EVE Online. It would still apply there as well. But I do think it's worth saying there are many known ways to scale damage, and they fundamentally divide into 4 different categories. There's scaling that's tied to your opponent, so this is things like shock, this is things like PathOfExile 1's intimidate mechanic, but it's also things like nerfing the monster's resistances through the use of curses. The second category is scaling that is tied to your character. So this is the biggest section. It's going to be last. This includes all your gear, this includes your passive tree, everything you can do to just put out more raw damage that then multiplies together with that scaling that's tied to the monster. The third thing is avoiding failed actions. A failed action is one that doesn't do anything useful to you. A couple of examples of what failed actions might look like. You pull out your bow and you fire at a monster that's running towards you. However, before your shot goes off, you get stunned by that monster. Your shot doesn't go off, you have a failed action. Second example, you fire at the monster, you get the shot off, but it misses because the monster is just not in a position on the screen that collides with where your arrow's trajectory is. The third example is that you do succeed in getting the arrow off. It does collide with the monster, but then there's an accuracy check, and you fail the accuracy check. All of these are examples of ways that actions can fail, and mitigating those is a way to scale your damage. It's important to note that this can be somewhat of an invisible way to scale your damage as well, and that's something that can be tricky when Path of Building or other similar programs for PathOfExile 2 end up coming online. Side note, I don't expect Path of Building for quite some time. Fourth and final of these categories is simply investing more time mid-combat into dealing damage. We'll come back to this one later because I think it's really important and it's also really subtle. In PathOfExile 1, this can be as simple as saying, okay, whenever this monster fires a particular attack at me, I have to drop everything and dodge. But I can drop a decoy totem behind the boss. And if I do that, then the boss is not going to attack me. And so I'm not going to have to physically dodge this particular move that the boss does. As a result, I can stand my ground and keep hitting the boss. Another example though, is that you might invest in life leech on your character. And then at that point, you might reach a spot where the boss keeps wailing away at you, but it doesn't matter what they do. You can just stand in place and repeat an attack over and over again, and the boss is going to die before you do because you're recovering more life than the boss is doing in damage. That's the dream scenario here where you get 100% damage uptime, but realistically, it's not going to be 100%, but the closer to 100% it is, the better. A couple of examples of each of these categories. Firstly, a monster suffers more damage because it's suffering from shock. Secondly, a player allocates the passive tree notable Spaghettification, which in part reads 29% increased chaos damage and then deals chaos damage. Or related, a player activates the Archmage buff, which has the text in part, spells gain 5% of damage as lightning damage for every 100 maximum mana you have. When it comes to avoiding failed actions, we've already kind of covered these. You can get stunned out of abilities, you can physics miss, or you can accuracy miss. And we've also covered some examples of increasing time that's spent actively dealing damage. So let's talk about ways that you might debuff the monster. This can be shock, this can be a curse that nerfs their resistances, it can be a whole bunch of other things. The poster child for this mechanic, of course, is shock, and a whole bunch of additional information is yet to be released about exactly how shock will work. Again, the upcoming Ailments 101 video and the Mobalytics write-up of that will have a whole bunch of details there. Now, ordinarily, you can only inflict one shock usefully on an enemy. You can throw more there, but they don't achieve anything. But the Stormweaver Ascendancy is going to allow you to excel at landing shocks. And one of the options there is Strike Twice, which is notable in the Ascendancy that allows you to break this one shock rule. You can have 2 shocks on an enemy instead, therefore scaling your damage even higher. Now, monsters can be debuffed through curses. Despair and Flammability are both going to exist in PathOfExile 2. Both are confirmed to be in, and this is not from leaks. This is from things Grinding Gear Games have teased. They're generally not going to be worth applying to monsters that you think are just going to fall over dead really, really fast. But if you're going to be fighting a monster for a little while, maybe you want to use one of these. Monster resistances can also be nerfed through the use of elemental exposure. We don't yet know much about the ways you can inflict elemental exposure, but I'm sure more will become available in time. Now, the written version of this guide is going to need to be updated many times as new ways are discovered to cause monsters to take additional damage. For example, the Intimidate mechanic from PathOfExile 1 could be added. Some things akin to PathOfExile 1's Baydat minions, I think it is. It's one of the Beyond Demons. They have an ability that causes players to take more damage. That might be something that we get the ability to inflict on monsters. There's a whole bunch of these things that are what you might term pseudo-shocks. They function kind of like shock, but they do have their own little nuances on the side. Now, when it comes to avoiding failed actions, I think one of the most important things to remember here is that programs like Path of Building from PathOfExile 1, they are very, very good at working out what happens when you're fighting a training dummy, but you're probably not fighting training dummies, you're fighting monsters that are fighting back. And in this situation, Path of Building will not capture the situation that comes up here, the monsters that have tools that undermine your actions. And player skills do no damage if they don't occur. I know that's obvious, but it kind of needs to be said because that is an assumption that Path of Building completely ignores. It's a very important one, and it's one that will be ignored by most of the theory crafting tools. So you want to factor in that monsters can inflict stun or freeze on the player to prevent your actions. Charms might be a solution to this, but we're going to have to play around with charms to get a sense as to how reliable they are. I have a feeling that charms are going to be kind of a real desperation heave. they're not going to be something that you want to be using very often. The single most important point though that I would make here, if you find yourself in a situation where you are suffering from an ability that causes you to lose control of your character, or that almost does that, so either you're monstrously slowed, or you are outright stunned, or you're outright frozen, or anything along these lines, what you want to do is look for warning signs that the monster that inflicted those abilities on you might have put out beforehand. If you can find one of those, then that's going to help prevent you from getting into this position in the future, which is what you want. Let's talk about some other specific solutions as well. If you've got a fast-moving monster, it can move out of the way of a skill before it lands. In this situation, you can counter this by investing in attack speed or cast speed, or potentially by projectile speed or increased AoE. All of these can help mitigate the ability of an opponent that has a mobility advantage against you. But probably most important is learning monster movement patterns. And additionally, skills that have long damage delays, cluster grenade comes to mind here, these are affected worst by these sorts of abilities of monsters. That is a time at which you're going to get the worst results from your skills that do damage, is when you're fighting a really fast moving monster and you're using a super slow skill. Monster mechanics that nerf player movement options are something you want to keep in mind as well. These can cause your skills to miss because you might have been counting on being 3 meters further ahead when the skill goes off, and instead you fire it from 3 meters behind and you miss the monster by 1.5 meters. Another thing that can come up and have the same effect is another monster just popping up out of nowhere and obstructing your movement. Now there'll be a whole bunch of tools that you can pick up between ascendancies, unique items, the passive tree, etc. These are likely to have solutions that you can spec into that will help your movement become more predictable and that will undermine the ability of monsters to interfere with your movement. So for instance, things that make it tougher for you to be frozen. What's going to happen here is that over the first couple of weeks, players are going to experiment with a whole bunch of these, and then we're going to consolidate on 3 or 4 of them that feel like they're the best. And then at that point, guides will be put out. This might take a couple of weeks to happen, but guides will be put out that work out the lowest opportunity cost ways. Or maybe they don't end up being quite perfect. They end up finding a low opportunity cost way of avoiding failed actions here that may not be the very best you can do, but that it is way better than anything you're likely to figure out on your own. Now, for all of these mechanics that are not tied to player stats, practice against that particular monster will help you a lot. Also want to point out a couple of other things that can cause bricked actions. The monsters tied to the expedition mechanic that have a frontal deflection shield that they can raise, these are going to be particularly nasty. They'll put up a shield, it's going to block damage that originates from the direction they're facing. Now, you might want to find a skill that can attack these monsters from behind somehow. It's also perfectly reasonable, though, to say, you know what, I'm not specializing in expedition, and as a result, I just don't care about these abilities. I shall leave the decision as to which of those routes you take to you, and it's going to come down to what your character is going to specialize in, which section of the endgame you want to be the best at. The accuracy stat can cause your attacks to miss as well, and this can waste an action. You want to mitigate this by investing in accuracy, but it is also possible to overinvest in accuracy, and at that point you start having a balance between, would I be better off if I did 10% more damage but 5% of my attacks missed? In terms of raw DPS, yes, you would be better off, but then that introduces the complication of sometimes being less reliable at killing the weakest monsters quickly. Is that a problem? For the moment, the answer is we simply don't know, but I'm going to leave that decision to you while you're in the planning stages, and then once our characters are actually at endgame, we'll be able to assess it clearly and then compare different strategies to each other. The next thing I want to discuss is the topic of spending more time doing damage. So when you're spending time dodging monster abilities, this is time that you are not spending unleashing your strongest abilities on monsters. Now, one thing you can do here, there is the raw mount that's going to be available to some of the range classes. That will allow you to jump onto a mount and then fire your bow whilst moving at full speed. This is a really strong option. It does have an opportunity cost though. It ties up 50 points of your spirit. Another thing that you might aspire to do though is simply to become so tanky that you don't need to dodge monster abilities. Now, builds that are optimized for the optional hardcore game mode, they tend to take this to extremes. The faster your character can move as well, the less disruptive it is to be forced to move. For instance, if there's a replica of PathOfExile 1's Shaper Slam, for those of you that aren't familiar, that have never fought this boss in PathOfExile 1, the boss targets you and you have 1.7 seconds to get something like 6 meters away from him. After that point, he drops a hammer down on top of the player that hits a fairly large area. I think it might be 5 or 6 meters in radius, and it deals a lot of damage. It's survivable now, but at the time that it came out, it was intended as a one-shot mechanic. Now, this is something that's well telegraphed. The boss will usually utter the words "erased by misery," and that tells you, oh, Slammer's coming, I better move. And then at that point, you rapidly disengage from the boss and get away into the corner, let him have his little slam, and after that, you then come back and start beating him up again. Now, if your character's movement speed is extremely slow, this is going to be really oppressive. You're going to lose a bunch of time to all of this travel that you need to do. But if your character's movement speed is super fast, then you can get right back in the action quickly. You'll also notice if you watch some of the very, very best players, the very, very best boss killers in particular, one thing they will do is quite narrowly miss a lot of these moves. They won't move miles outside it, they'll move just outside it, so that they minimize the amount of time that they spend making these repositionings. So what this really comes down to is movement speed is not a good DPS stat. It's a very good defensive stat. It's a very good thing to have on your character in general, but it is something that does serve an offensive purpose even when it comes to fighting bosses. One of the things though that I think is among the least obvious of the effects of some of these indirect ways that you can do more damage, if your character is capable of finishing an attack quicker or finishing a spell off quicker, this can be a really large source of extra damage. The reason for this is not just because you can cast more spells per turn when you stand in place, but it's also because it is less disruptive to you. You'll lose less of an existing cast on average if you are forced to abandon a cast in order to dodge some particular ability. And this in fact becomes more important the faster the enemies act and the more deadly their actions become. Okay, so I said I'm saving player damage scaling for last. Let's go through it. This is essentially raw character power. This is a measure of all of the things that make your build as strong as it is. Whether it be your passive tree, whether it be your gear, whether it be the support gems you're electing to use, whether it be your character's ascendancy, the buffs that are granted by spirit reserving skills, whether it be short-term buffs. For instance, maybe you've used Ice Bite and then you've slain an enemy that's been frozen whilst you've been using that Ice Bite, and then that's caused you to have an additional buff on your character, and that buff on your character gives your entire character a bunch of extra damage. There's a lot of ways that you can scale player damage, but ultimately most of it comes down to gear and the passive tree. I want to quickly go through one of the most important things Path of Exile 1 players have to learn, and this is also going to apply in Path of Exile 2. There is a difference between the words more and increased in this game. Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 both use the terms more and increased for damage, and have very, very different meanings to each other in game, despite the fact that just the plain English meanings of both words are basically the same thing. So more and increased multipliers almost always specify types of damage they apply to. They don't usually apply to all damage a character deals. There'll be damage that meets certain criteria. It might be damage done with a two-handed mace, or it might be chaos damage, or it might be something else entirely. Now these more and increased multipliers will only apply to your character if you're dealing the right sort of damage. Let's talk about the difference between them though. More damage multipliers and their opposite, less damage multipliers, all of these multiply together. Now this can cause them to have a huge stacking effect. Essentially, each individual one tends to have more of an impact than an increased modifier would have. And also, more damage multipliers in general are quite a lot better than increased ones, unless the numbers have a massive divergence. So you would take 50% increased damage over 5% more damage if you had a choice between the two, although you would want both, but you would take 20% more damage over 50% increased damage on almost all characters. Now it's important to note that there are increased damage and the reverse reduced damage multipliers. These all get added to each other, and only then do you make them into one multiplication layer. Let's do a little bit of a case study, and I'm going to dial this one up to 11. I'm going to take a really unrealistic, really extreme example here that I think just will pound home the point of how different these are. In reality, the gap is going to be less wide than this. So let's take a character that has 5 effects, and each of them read 200% increased damage. These add up to 1000%, so you deal 11 times baseline damage. Second example, your character instead has 5 effects that read 200% more damage. In this situation, each of these individually triples the amount of damage your character deals. So when you apply 1, you go to triple baseline. When you apply 2, non-uple baseline. When you apply 3, 27 times baseline. 4 of them, 81 times baseline. And when you've got all 5 of them, 243 times baseline. So this is more than 22 times as much damage as you would get from having 5 200% increased multipliers on your character. In practice, you're not going to have numbers that are quite this big. In fact, they're not going to be anything like 200% more multipliers, but the same effect is still going to apply. So as you can see, more multipliers are precious, even the small ones, but especially the large ones. One of the first things you want to do when you're planning a build is just start with a really important question. What big more multipliers can I fit onto this build? It's perhaps the most important question you're going to ask when you're setting your character up. Now, increased multipliers, on the other hand, they're always good, but they fall off in value. The more of them that you have, the less noticeable each new one will become. So you still want these boosts, but they don't become as important, and you're more willing to forgo them in exchange for chasing down the next more multiplier, or potentially in exchange to chasing down some other sort of boost for your character. For instance, movement speed might be something you want instead. So back on this question of stats that scale damage, we have more and increased modifiers. We have weapon base damage is something that scales damage. We have base damage printed on spell gems, and this increases as the gem becomes higher level. We have critical hit modifiers. Now, the upcoming Critical Hits 101 video, that's going to clarify a bunch of how this works, because they have changed since PathOfExile 1. And then we have gem level increases, things like +5 to the level of all lightning spell skill gems. Then we have text that reads things like gain 20% of damage as extra lightning damage or similar. And here, if you had 1000 cold and 500 fire damage, then you would still deal 1000 cold, you'd still deal 500 fire, but you'd also deal 300 lightning. Then anything that you've got that scales elemental damage is going to boost all of that up. Anything you have that scales only cold damage, though, it's just going to boost the cold damage. It's not going to boost that bonus lightning damage that you get. Now, you'll usually want to focus on just one type of damage on many builds, and that maximizes your options for getting increased damage modifiers on the passive tree. Now, there will be exceptions to this, and there will sometimes be times that you want to have 2 skills on the same character, one of them that's going all in on scaling cold, and the other one that's going all in on scaling lightning, or some other combination along those lines. A spell that deals cold damage and also has gain X% of damage as extra cold damage is going to end up being easier to scale than if you instead had gain X% of damage as added fire damage. That would be something that would end up harder to scale because you'd have to have things that scale cold and fire damage simultaneously. Those will probably exist, but there won't be as many. And the same sort of thing applies when it comes to weapons. Now, this part actually changed since the first time I recorded this. Grungy Games have now announced there will be flat damage increases, which are modifiers like X to Y cold damage added to spells or attacks, but for attacks only in PathOfExile 2. Those hadn't been teased, but they have announced since that they will exist for attacks, but they will not exist for spells at all. What this means is that you cannot circumvent the need for good high-level spell gems simply by stacking flat damage as an alternative. You are going to need to have high-level spell gems because they're going to be a multiplier to the damage you're doing. Good weapons, however, are something that you're still going to want, but they're not quite going to be as urgent because you can function without them just by virtue of stacking some of this flat damage, at least assuming you can get moderate amounts of it. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that boosting cast speed or attack speed is a more multiplier to the total damage that you do. So if you can cast 12 spells in the time it would take another player to cast 10, that's 20% more damage. But it's also 20% more mana consumption. And this can be a real problem because skills you can't afford to cast do no damage. I want you to plan accordingly and just think about this. In PathOfExile 1, that wouldn't have been a big problem, but in PathOfExile 2, it might be. And ultimately, you might find yourself in a restricted situation where, yeah, you've got the extra time, and that can be useful just for moving around, but you can't actually afford to just spam your main spell all the time. And I have one final thought that I want to leave you with here. This is not something I'm going to give a universal answer to. This is something that's going to change based upon the particular encounters that you're facing. There are skills in PathOfExile 2 that don't do very much damage, but what they can do is make the next skill you use do more damage by breaking the monster's armor, by applying freeze, by applying shock, by applying ignite. There's a whole lot of different things that can happen. You want to be asking yourself, is it worth firing off a weak skill in order to empower several subsequent ones? Against the weakest of monsters, the answer is going to be an emphatic no. No, you just want to do things that are going to one-shot these monsters if you can. Against middling tier monsters, maybe it's worth it, maybe it's not. But against the toughest of monsters, you're probably going to want to do this. This is going to be one of the things you're always going to want to have in your head in PathOfExile 2. There are going to be times and places for all of your skills, and sometimes against the hardest monsters, you're going to think, you know, I've got my main skill that I use almost all the time, but I actually don't want to use this against the boss. I have different tools. Just like you might find that a hammer is the most frequently used tool in your toolkit, but when it comes to repairing a window, it's not the sharpest tool in the shed. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. My Evalobs have interesting results, and down in the description below, I'll put a link to the Mobalytics version of this guide, which is going to be updated more frequently than this video gets. Thank you for your time.